Madam Clerk, could you read the roll?
Hey.
Here.
Present.
Yes.
Present.
Here. Reverend McDowell, you mind doing the invocation?
And all that we say and do, words are not adequate enough to say how grateful and thankful we are. With all the things that are happening in this city of ours, we simply ask that you might be with all of our department heads, those persons who give of themselves through their service and connectedness to this city. Bless and keep us in your care. We understand that in the midst of all that we do today, it is not just for work, but for this community we call Columbia. We thank you, and we say amen.
Amen.
Ready to get started? Okay. Moving forward with our city council discussion items for today, this is a budget workshop, and so all of the items are moving us in that direction. And the first is the fiscal year 2023-2024 revenues. Ms. Missy Kaufman, Budget Program Management and Grants Director. And we'll move through all of these items with myself and Jeff chiming in, particularly on items 1 through 4. I would say that, you know, we always start with revenues to try to lay the foundation, set the tone, kind of help you get a better feel for where we are in that regard. But I would also ask that you're thinking about some of the things that we will want to accomplish in the new budget year. So think about revenues because we have to pay for those things, right? So we'll also throw out a few of the things that I know, and that's just based off things you've said, you know, particular programs. I know the mayor, we're going to have an opportunity not to go in great detail about some potential new programs, but a couple of items that, particularly with H-tags and or A-tags, that you all have said, and we agree that maybe based off eligibility, we want to consider using or maximizing those funds differently going forward, maybe in different ways than we've used them in the past. So we'll get to that, but we'll start with the revenue discussion and then jump into that fiscal year 23-24 hospitality tax and accommodations tax projections and budget recommendations as well.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. So as mentioned, with City Council, we are here today to discuss our proposed budget, beginning with our revenue discussions, as we like to start out every year. And I did not bring up the right documents, but that's okay. We can move on. As we begin discussions regarding our budget with different revenue sources, of course, we like to start out by stating that the revenue projections are as of today, and they will continue to change and update as we go throughout the budget process. So just want to keep that in everyone's mind as we're looking forward. But as we start the budget process, is we start to put together the priorities from City Council, the commitments and programs that you have already made commitments for in the coming year, as well as, of course, continued services. We have to balance that with available revenues in order to bring us into a balanced budget. So this is just a component of that discussion. Just a little bit of overview. Of course, the general fund, our revenue sources are based on the different revenue streams that we have. General fund, enterprise funds, and then grants and special revenues. The general fund, of course, covers our general operations, including property taxes, business licenses, fines and forfeitures, intergovernmental and so forth, charges for services. But also as a part of the general fund is our transfers and other financing sources. Enterprise, of course, would be our business utility, our business services, water and sewer fund, our stormwater fund, and our parking fund, our enterprise services. The grants and special revenues are also general governmental, but of course, we have different grant sources. Special revenues would be the hospitality tax, accommodations tax, and our tourism development fee. They are designated special revenue by accordance to state law in accordance to what the purpose of those funds are, restricting the specific use for those activities as well.
Missy, just to point out that tourism development fee, other municipal governments and county governments call it the state accommodation tax. And we predated the legislation that established the state accommodation tax, but we never have changed the name of that fund to state accommodation tax. That is where it's coming from.
Right, we have a state accommodations and local accommodations. There's actually a third in there, I think, as well. But when we refer to accommodations tax, it's referring to state accommodations tax that's collected and remitted by the state.
Tourism development,
Tourism development fee is our local accommodations tax that the city collects.
okay. It's reverse. Just a reverse, okay, right. Okay. Gotcha.
But you're right, Howard, we were ahead of the curve at that time.
All right. As mentioned a little bit already, our revenue projection sources, of course, we have a couple of different ways that we do our revenue projections. We look, of course, at our prior year, yes,
On the slide before,
this one or the,
no, go one more. No, you went too far. There
this,
we go, yeah.
okay.
At some point, can we get the reconcile of what our bond covenants and financial policies around for those reserves, just so I think it'd be helpful for everybody to understand how much we're having to reserve and what we're paying on just as we look forward. Because we have multiple bonds, as you know, from water and sewer, GO, capital lease, but understanding what we're required and what we have. I'm not sure that everybody understands that. It just, at some point during the budget thing, I think it'd be good to show that we have reserved our money and we're very well covered.
Right. Some of that we'll cover here, but I think what I'm also hearing you ask for is possibly the codification of what the rules are regarding our reserves, like what we have in terms of like our general fund surplus, fund balance, our
We've been
general fund.
very conservative, and I think it's good, and I think it's good for people to know that.
Absolutely. That is a good information to have. We can provide that. Okay. Yes. So part of our revenue projections, of course, we look at prior year and current year collections. We're still coming out of, especially looking back at prior year collections, of course, some of these revenues were affected by COVID, so we have to adjust for that as we're looking at COVID year collections and then, of course, prior year collection activities. We also get input from our department staff with regarding what they are seeing for the different sources of revenues that they may collect, permits, industry forecasts, and then, of course, their customer different registrations. Legislature has an impact on our revenue streams, whether it's our state shared revenues that come in from the state of South Carolina, that's determined by the state of South Carolina. If there's any new rules or expectations with regards to changes to state law with regarding a certain revenue sources. We also look at South Carolina Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Office in terms of their projections with regards to the economy and what they see is what's happening in the state. And then, of course, we also utilize rate consultants on certain revenues that are generated from specific revenue streams. In terms of our revenue forecast overview, our projections, especially at this time of the budget development cycle, are pretty conservative. We are obviously at this point in time, we're continuing to review and update our revenues as we go along. The revenues that are forecast for you today do not reflect any rate adjustments or any increases in fees or rates. Of course, we are projecting our preliminary And then, of course, the other thing to point out here with this slide in particular is that different revenues have different cycles of generation. Property taxes, for instance, come in primarily one time a year, whereas things like hospitality tax, accommodations tax, and parking funds and water and sewer rates, they come in every month. So some of these collections we're able to get a better idea about where we are actual today than we are with some sources. Then there's some revenues, for instance, accommodations tax that are remitted quarterly by the state of South Carolina. So we've of course only received 2 quarters for this fiscal year. And something like accommodations was most impacted by COVID, so that makes our crystal ball, if you will, a little fuzzier. And so that's important for us to point out, just for you all, in the sense of understanding about where we are with revenue projections and why things get a little more clear as we proceed through the budget process. Business license is another major source of revenue that comes in for the city. Those aren't collected until May. So we're really not, when we're looking at those projections, we're looking back from a year. And of course, the actual collections are reported. So when we did budget projections for the current year, we were making those projections in April, but then those revenues came in by May. So of course, but now that we're in where we are, we're looking back to where we were a year ago as well.
And Missy, as to bullet point number 2, right now with where we are, as Missy is describing, we're giving you projections based off the best that we know. It also doesn't necessarily reflect the continued discussions we'll have with you that might require a look, which we talk about this in a few slides or put a note there, that if, for example, you would like us to take a hard look at special events, which the fees associated that we have never charged as a city, it's been said that that's an interest that you all have, and I certainly have an interest in it. That would then be something that we would bring back during this budget process. All of our staff and the labor and everything that goes into preparing for special events like St. Patrick's Day that we just had, and a festival of that magnitude. So those are the type things. So I don't want you to see that no rate adjustments or increases are reflected in the projected revenues and think that we're not still early in this process and we've got to come back with some recommendations.
And I think some of the ongoing conversations as well, one of the things that we continue to talk about is it's time for pretty much a citywide audit to make sure that the properties that should be paying into property tax are actually paying, and that's a discussion, ongoing discussion with the county to make sure that we're actually collecting that. And I know that every other city on special events, we're a bargain compared to almost every other city because costs have increased. Right. And I think we're about $15 lower than the majority of the cities in South Carolina. So
yes, sir.
Those will be things we definitely need to be talking about. And I know that we wanted to look at fines as well, working with the legislature to give us some more, especially around litter and dumping and other things where we're handicapped. But yes, I think we need to look at everything as we move forward.
Do we have the data on special events from other cities?
Well, we're going to dig even deeper too, just with some recommendations internally as well.
There's some policy programs and stuff that a lot of cities adopted with it, and I think that's what the manager's referencing.
And then in terms of parking, I know we're still waiting for some of the parking study results, but we've talked a little bit about potentially changing the fee structure for that as well, I think, in the past. And the $8 tickets.
Yes, yes.
All right, general fund revenues. To give you an idea about where we are now, we look back, of course, like we've talked about a little bit of where we have come from. So fiscal year 2021, fiscal year 21-22 revenues, of course, were projected with a little less information than what we normally would have had in terms of making projections. And then, of course, fiscal year 22-23, we did include in the current year budget a number of one-time revenues that were reflected to include $2 million from the American Rescue Plan funds. That's a part of the budget. And then, of course, in the fall, City Council made additional allocations from a number of sources to include our general fund surplus, additional hospitality tax, and some other revenue streams that amended the current year budget by almost $17 million, primarily for investments in capital improvement programs. Most of those were, of course, one-time one-time expenses, but of course, they're coming from one-time revenues as well. At this point, early projections are showing that we are in line to meet the budget projections with the current fiscal year, which is great. That's where we at least want to be at this point in time. In terms of revenue forecast for going forward, we are seeing closer to normal collections. Projections are still, again, I don't know how many times I've said this now, conservative, and we'll continue to update. As Ms. Wilson mentioned, we did not include any fees in the general fund with regards to special revenues or rate adjustments, but are in consideration of reviewing. Staff will be making recommendations regarding special events fees and preparations. In terms of our general fund revenues for next year, we're estimated at this point of $144 million. That's revenues only. That's a slightly more than $2 million increase over current year actual revenues, which is right under 2%. In terms of transfers in and out, that's going to be some of the biggest adjustment. We have not reflected at this point any use of ARPA funds in the 23-24 budget, so that would be about a $2 million reduction. And then the biggest adjustment is from the current, the projections from next year compared to the amended budget, which again reflects the use of the one-time allocations for investments in capital improvement programs. We did continue the use of the $3 million in fund balance, which is the same as the current year. So otherwise, transfers in are coming in line with what we've used in terms of the normal revenues that we project. It might be a little bit easier to speak from this slide. It was too much to try to put all together. But you can see where we have made projections for the current year to be in line with our next year projections to be in line with the current year. And then, of course, those things that were one time are not reflected next year. The majority of our increases there is coming from other agencies, which is a combination of different sources, state shared revenue being one of them. Okay.
So generally, you've estimated that it'll be the same as the amended budget.
For now.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. The revenues in the amended budget really did not change when we amended the budget, because everything that was amending this year's budget was a transfer in from other sources. We didn't actually end up making any projection changes to, or any changes to the revenues
Okay, thank you.
in the amended budget. Just a little demonstration in terms of where our sources of revenues come in for the general fund, the majority of which comes from property taxes. And you can see how we're pretty level in terms of our collections of revenues for the general fund compared to prior years. No big major swings up or down. In particular, no downward swings, which is a positive sign, but probably not the growth that we would maybe like to see. But general fund is at least a steady source at this point. Property tax assessments, just to demonstrate a little bit again, sort of where we are with regards to growth in the assessment of our property tax values. As pointed out, the city has not raised property taxes in more than 12 years.
Actually decreased.
We actually decreased with the assessment. We are maintaining the property tax increase in the current year budget. Probably the biggest thing in here in terms of showing is the growth of our assessment values, which of course demonstrate the growth in our revenue projections. That's just.
I think it's 24.
Yes.
Feel like that too, but I think they reassess every year because it goes up. I mean, everybody says it's not a reassessment year, but the millage went up. I'm like, yeah, the value did, not the millage itself.
Value. And the city's revenue, the city's millage, of course, is just a portion, less than 20% of your total property tax bill.
17%, and in
Yes.
some areas only 14%.
Yes,
I was in an area the other day that they didn't realize that.
right. We have a combined, residents have a combined property tax bill, so that property tax, your property tax bill reflects all of your local and government services, not just the city of Columbia. General fund balance, so as mentioned, city council made a pretty significant allocation from fund balance, in the fall in terms of commitment to the, capital investments, which is a great use of one-time funds for one-time revenues. I don't want to throw anyone off by showing that we have a slight $102,000 deficit. That will certainly be cleared up as we, in the fiscal year. This is based on projected revenues, which this will all be adjusted as we go throughout the year. We're not actually anticipating we will end the year with a negative fund balance, but at this point in time, this is just mostly demonstrating that you have made significant investments so far in our capital improvements.
And that has paid off in terms of it being negative.
It was, we haven't had a negative fund balance at all. We've had a collective, this is a collection of fund balances over the years, of course. Based on,
Show some positivity at the end of 2024.
this is projecting as of, so this is starting with fund balance as of June of last year, last fiscal year we've completed, utilizing those commitments that are reducing from our starting fund balance of 38 million. Right, and then we have a reserve, as we mentioned a little bit ago. The city has a general fund reserve of 15%. That's often called our rainy day fund. That means that amount of money is set aside in the general fund, is not utilized unless there's a purpose or need for it. And then, that is
What she's trying to say in a simple way is the deficit there really isn't a deficit.
correct. It just means that there's not available funds out of this fund balance to be for allocation. Really, the city's remaining fund balance is right at 17.1 million. Then an additional allocation, like as mentioned, right at $17 million. And then the nonprofit, $300,000, city council's actually returned some of those funds, so that $102,000 would be returned, would lower that deficit as well.
Our fund balance invested in the local government fund and the state treasury.
I don't know that answer. That's
I think we're
that's
getting
a
a better
finance question.
yield. I think we're getting about 4.57% yield from other sources.
At least the comptroller's not.
So we're gonna continue our discussions with the capital lease. Oh, are you about to?
I was just going to answer his. She's
Oh,
still-
okay.
So-
Oh, I'm sorry.
We have our funds, so it'll be the general fund, cash from the water and sewer, all of our additional funds out there. It's invested in a portfolio that includes the state, local government investment pool. It also includes investments with other banks through CDs, through other deposits, and then through some treasuries as well.
Yeah, we got quite a few more slides before you're up. I'm sorry.
Yep. So moving on, any questions about our general fund revenues before we move on into?
When do you think you'll have, I know this is a guesstimate, but, your best guess, end of May, maybe? 1st of June?
For revenues, we will definitely have revenue for you by the time the city manager makes her recommendation for a proposed budget in May.
Okay. Great, thank you.
It'll change a few times before
Oh, I
then.
know.
And then when we actually go to advertise the budget, is when we'll have our final projections. Mhm. That will be in May. Moving on to our stormwater fund, we are skipping over water and sewer, and we'll come back to that. Moving into our stormwater fund. Stormwater revenues are coming in pretty strong. We, of course, were conservative on projections for the current fiscal year. City council has paused on the fifth year of a 5-year rate increase. So we maintain revenues conservatively in the current fiscal year. However, projections going forward are more reflective of what we actually collected in the prior year, so right about 17 million. City Council several months back did ask for an analysis of our revenues. So that revenue analysis or rate analysis is underway, and we expect it to be completed this month. So in April, we'll be coming back, staff will be coming back to you with the completion of that review. But overall, of course, our stormwater fund funds our stormwater activities, of which there is a excess of $100 million CIP that has been proposed over the past several years. City Council makes allocations every year towards that capital improvement program with significant investment so far to include debt service or borrowed funds for our stormwater capital improvement program, of which these funds are covering that debt service as well as the operations of the stormwater utility, which is funds our Public Works Department for their actual activities, engineering, and are the primary uses for stormwater. Any questions about stormwater? Okay. Stormwater cash is looking pretty strong. Again, it's sitting at about $50 million. Those funds are actually, of course, there's at least $100 million CIP over that has been around for a while, so these funds are utilized for that capital improvement program. So it's pretty strong.
So when you say $100 million in CIP projects that we need to spend this on?
No, that's taking in consideration a $100 million program that has been in place that council allocates an amount towards every year.
Got it.
That's what the initial 5-year rate adjustment was to address. And of course, the majority of these funds are made up from bond proceeds, so that's not like available cash just to use in any way. Either way, it has to be utilized for the stormwater funds, stormwater program, both capital and operating. Parking fund, Dr. Bustle's already made reference to use of or looking at our stormwater funds. That rate study is also underway, and we anticipate it to be completed in April. With bringing that forward to City Council for recommendations and input from City Council before moving forward.
And at that time, City Manager, would it be appropriate as we talk about the parking study, also about what we may look at innovatively, technology, partnerships? I know that the City of Charleston and other cities have made some bolder moves on outsourcing parts that have benefited, and it may be worth, but a good time for us to analyze all of our, especially with some of our upcoming needs.
Yes, sir. I think part of the, of us waiting on the parking study and having it come forth now was because we needed to go back and specifically ask the consultant to look at some of those things as well.
That's great. Thank you.
So you've shared with that consultant some of our conversations about vision of how to move forward with that. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So looking forward into our special revenues, which includes the hospitality tax, the state accommodations tax, and our local tourism development fee. Starting with hospitality tax, projected revenues are right at $13.4 million. That's about a $716,000 or 6% increase above the current year. So hospitality tax revenues continue to remain strong in terms of collections. Prior to the pandemic, looking at about a 5-year average, we were seeing about 3 to 4% growth per year. That's up a little. There were a few years, I think, a little slower growth, but now we are seeing pretty steady. Of course, that's based on also on budgeted. Collections are actually coming in strong. As mentioned, collections are coming in closer at normal levels. We have not utilized any use of fund balance in the proposed budget, which is typical. Usually, we bring to you a budget that just reflects revenues collected for that year, or for the projected revenues for that year. There was a significant amount of fund balance that was committed in the fall with the Finley Park project. The budget that is presented for you at this point, while we're talking about revenues today for hospitality tax and accommodations tax, we are looking to have some input from city council in terms of allocations potentially for specific functions, so that as we're building the budget and the city manager brings her proposed budget to you, we can reflect those allocations that way. With regards to hospitality tax, the only, we're not reviewing any recommendations for funding today, other than discussions that what you have funded in the current fiscal year. So there's a couple of different allocations that we talk about with regards to the hospitality tax. Of course, there are the committee the committee allocations. That amount is what the committee would use to make their recommendations of funding for the applications, the hospitality tax grant applications, that will come back to city council for final approval. Current fiscal year, city council allocated $3 million in the budget for hospitality tax. As you recall, not all of those funds were committed, and then council came back. The committee made a second round of allocations that were done, again, for a second allocation that was made in December for the January to June period. It was a much smaller amount, but was reflective of some allocations that were made post the committee recommendations. Then, of course, there's also line item agencies. While they also submit the allocations to a committee, or they submit an application just like any other agency or any other grant recipient. And they are still subject to the same rules and laws that everyone else is with regard to H-tax use. City council makes those designations for our funding. The one thing to point out in the line item agencies is that does reflect the use of a final commitment, a multi-year commitment to the Museum of Art for their capital improvement program of $300,000. So roughly $300,000 is additional available if city council were to I guess fund at the same levels as the current year.
So,
Actually, it's an additional, just a supplemental page.
okay, so the 7.2 million that you have on the bottom line there, out of that comes the 3 million or 3 million plus that goes to the committee for allocation, and the 2.8 that we did last year for line items.
Right, so the only thing that is reflected in next year's budget that's already programmed, if you will, out of the projected $13 million revenues is the debt service, which of course, that has to be addressed up front and first. That would be for the hospitality tax bonds. And then also, since we've already reflected $3.7 million which is same amount as prior years in terms of transfers to the general fund. So those are the amounts already programmed into the budget. The remaining balance of $7 million would be available for city council to allocate to these other components. The other allocations are some other commitments that city council has funded in the past that's separate from the committee. They're not necessarily line items, but they are commitments that city council has made over the year, for instance, to the Parks and Recreation Foundation, specifically for some city-sponsored events, and then also to
Miss, is that similar
River
to what
Alliance.
we did multi-year allocations for the museum?
so the
Because
multi-year.
we did that some years ago, I think.
We did, city council did, you made an allocation to the Columbia Museum of Art.
That's correct.
For a capital improvement campaign that they had. And rather than fund it all up front, you funded in a certain amount for over a 5-year period. This year's budget reflects the final year of that 5-year
Yeah,
commitment.
that's the question I was gonna ask. When was going to be that final year?
The current year that we're in today,
Okay, good.
yes.
Not part of the 7.25. It will be paid out this year.
Correct. It will be paid out of the current fiscal year. That's right.
Uh,
The
missing-
that $300,000 is reflected in this 2.8 million under line item agencies.
Okay, gotcha. there was a question on meeting track. Minute track, same thing.
For you, it's meeting
There was a
track.
question on minute track from Dr. Bustles about the line item agencies, and you've got an explanation in your presentation here, but I think it's important to say that, because I've got a meeting tomorrow with a group that wants to be a line item agency. The line item agencies have traditionally been something that we have a connection to. The city has a connection to, like CMA, we own the building and
Yeah,
all
yeah.
that stuff. And we're required for them. Yeah, and other things. I think the only one that's not, doesn't have a direct connection to the city is the Philomena. And so,
I think it's important for us to be consistent as to why something is a line item agency, which is, we talked about this briefly last year, but, you know, as we continue our conversations, I think we need to be transparent about if there is a clear connection to the city, whether it's a fiduciary responsibility or some other thing that requires it, I think they should stay a line item, but I don't want this to become a
yeah,
free-for-all.
I agree with you.
You do?
Yes, I do.
Amazing.
Well, I'm hoping that we can continue to be able to grow the hospitality committee pot. I do think the committee has
Yeah.
valid and does a really good job, because it is really based on folks from all over the community.
At the end of the day, the line item designation doesn't really do much.
It doesn't.
I mean, we still get a bite
At the end of the day, yeah.
Yeah, but I still feel like for groups that are coming on, you know, getting off the ground, or groups that haven't traditionally had like those equitable opportunities, it does get perceived like it's a little bit more important because it's written out in the budget, right? So,
But they have to go through the same procedure. They do the interview and everything.
So that's correct. Line item agencies, they still have to submit an application. They are still subject to the same rules as any other organization that's receiving funding, just like the city is. We are also beholden to state law in terms of the use of these funds and according to what is eligible. The other part about I would say about line item agencies, for a long time, the line item agencies were held flat for many years. So they were held they were actually locked in at a certain amount. The committee has fluctuated, and of course, the number of applications that come in are fluctuated. City council has not has over the years sometimes has designated or has asked that certain types of groups or types of activities, if you think about committees, whether it's more investment in startup groups, or if it's more investments in events, or if it's more startups in like brick and mortar. There's not been those type of specific designations or considerations, but we do try to share that information with you whenever the committee does make its recommendations.
And Missy, I would add, I think the discussion is really relevant, what, you know, Dr. Bustles is bringing up, and Mr. Duvall, that it's a balancing act too, because whether or not yes, you all have the ultimate decision-making authority about it, I think there over the years becomes a reliance upon those groups that are line items that, you know, they just maybe feel like it's an automatic thing. And as you all, particularly this council, has put forth new initiatives and things that are internal needs of the city and priorities, I do think you know, should continue to put it on the table, so it's not just, you know, like it is necessarily going to happen, because our needs are changing and we're growing, and there are other eligible expenses of H-Tax that, you know, I've already said we want to put on the table, and you all have asked us to. So I think it's very responsible of you all to at least put it out there that it's not a guaranteed thing, and that other, you know, other entities may be wanting to take advantage through the committee as well. And so just that whole balancing act that you all are bringing up, I think is very important.
I do agree with the mayor also that the committee is, $3 million that we give to the committee needs to grow at least at the 6% that we are projecting for the fund.
agreed.
You know, everybody wants to be a line item. No question about that. Everybody wants to be a line item. And I think the needs has to be sort of centered around whatever those priorities are in the city and how that configures itself in terms of allocations. We just cannot continue to just give out money without a specific understanding of what those priorities are for the city. Now, I understand that priorities are gonna change. They're gonna change. And as we accomplish, say, one priority, we have to put another one in place. So everybody wants to be at the top of the heap, and I'd love to have them at the top of the heap. But of course, we've got to understand that those priorities are central to what those needs are.
Well said, Reverend. That is exactly in line with what city staff discusses in regards to how we utilize these funds. The way city council has allocated these funds, of course, stays flexible from as priorities change, so does your direction to, like, for instance, the committee, in terms of where you'd like to see the funds go. That would in part be some of where we would discuss for, and I think it's probably best to go ahead and just mention too.
Missy, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
just one last thing. Will the committee itself understand what those priorities are and how they are relatable to H-Tax?
That's a great segue. So the committee, the application process for
And I think
hospitality.
that's what you've been trying to do, Mayor.
Yes, sir.
I think that's what he's been trying to do, and it would certainly be a way for us to get at some real critical and crucial needs, understanding that the committee itself has a general understanding of what those priorities are.
Correct. So the committee, so the hospitality tax application, grant applications are, that grant process is currently open. Applications are due the end of this month, March 31st. So while there's not been specific instructions in the hospitality tax guidelines, it's still, of course, possible that city council may want to give specific direction or instructions to the committee in terms of what you're looking for with regards to to their recommendations. Between now and when they meet, which they meet in early May.
I think, the committee, but outside the committee, as we move forward, we have several ideas that we've talked about, from citywide arts programs to some opportunities to invest in some of our historic neighborhoods and prop up some opportunities there that will make a big difference. So I think it's going to be I think as we continue to want to do things, as, New Year's Eve, maybe, Christmas in the city pop up, some things to really get folks to feel good about the community. And I think we're looking for options that we can have throughout the year, that really engage our community in all 4 districts. So I think as we move forward, we're going to be creative. We're going to try some different things, and hopefully we'll have a good response and get a lot of engagement. So I think we're in a good path, and I think moving forward on, the allotment to the committee and increasing that somewhat, I think would be very beneficial as well, so.
Mayor, so we will have, once the process begins, an opportunity to revisit some of the things we've talked about in making those
Absolutely.
changes. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. And I think, Councilman Duval made reference to the 6%. I think that would roughly worked out to be about $180,000 increase. If you were to look at making an additional increase to the committee, be $180,000.
And I would hope that we do that and give them the flexibility not to have to dish it out all at one time. If they want to do 2 allotments, because things do pop up. And I personally rather it go to a committee than people coming individually to council, which then creates, a whole series of other issues. And I think a committee's a process, it's application-based. You have to submit all your paperwork, and I think that's probably the best way to go. So I think hopefully we can do that.
Okay. All right. Of course, looking at the hospitality tax fund balance, we had a beginning fund balance of about 5.5 million. with the budget so far, in terms of use of the fund balance of 4.7 million. 4 million of that was for, the largest portion of that was towards Finley Park program, or Finley Park Rehabilitation Project. Some of that is also carry forward from groups that are allowed to carry forward their commitments to a future year. So at this point, we are projecting a fund balance of about 820,000. Staff has made recommendations in the past to preserve about 10% of those funds, so that as we have fluctuations in the collections, we have some adjustments there. Of course, that's up to city council consideration. It's not a codified
I think at this
reserve, but
point, we
it's a
ought to try to hold
recommendation.
on to it so that as things pop up and opportunities for us to do some citywide things, we have something there. If we don't need it right now to fill any gaps, let's just kind of make a plan to hold on to it so that we have a little flexibility over the year.
Hold on to
The
the
820, yeah.
It also keeps you from having to dip into the committee or the line
Right.
item agency allocation, so it makes available flexibility for city council use to do exactly the things that you've mentioned so far. And some other things that we'll be discussing today. Okay, accommodations tax, there's a lot more discussion here with regards to just some information that is available for you. We are projecting at 2.9 million, which is slightly below what we actually collected last year. And in part, that's just because of how accommodations tax revenues come in. We will only have 2 months of collections to actually look at while they are on target to meet budget. We want to make, and to meet the projections that we've made, we're staying conservative. Especially conservative here because these funds are, I mean, you allocate these funds entirely except for this current fiscal year, so it's not a lot of fund balance there to work with. So we do have debt being issued now from accommodations tax, so we want to make sure that we're conservative in our projections. The only designation in this budget is not specifically what to allocate, but the projections in this budget that is before you is just reflective of what state law designates for the use of these funds. $25,000 off the top by state law automatically goes to the general fund. 30% is allocated for advertising and promotion of tourism. 65% is allocated for tourism-related expenditures, and then 5% that are for general purposes. The staff will be making some funding recommendations regarding eligible use of communication and marketing services of the city that's been discussed with city council. We've not designated an amount or recommended an amount at this time as we make sure eligible use of those funds for the purposes that we're discussing, but wanted to make sure that we did acknowledge that city council has asked for that consideration. So the combined 30% for advertising and promotion of tourism and the 65% allocated for tourism-related expenditures, that equals about $1.8 million of the projected budget. In the past, those funds have been allocated primarily to 2 groups, the Experience Columbia and Lake Murray Tourism. Have both been the recipients of those specific funds. State law is pretty clear about those funds being allocated to a Visitors Bureau organization. So that's why those funds have been typically reserved specifically for the 2 tourism bureaus that cover the city of Columbia. Of course, we've reflected $25,000 from the transfer to the general fund, and then the debt service of $900,000 that at this point is an estimate, but we've considered that it's that approximate amount. We'll know that closer to. Any questions about?
So the 5% general purpose, so about 150,000, that's where we would have flexibility for other uses, other than the visitor, okay.
That's correct. City council in the past has used those for specific, the current fiscal year, you used a portion of it to allocate for community promotion grants, which are grants that it's a grant program that we've offered in the past or that you've done that have less restrictive use than like than the hospitality tax would use. And then also too, you've done, that is also where you funded the other portion of One Columbia's contract.
And I think we've talked about potentially using it for some of our beautification efforts and so.
Any other questions about accommodations? That committee also is meeting, and I was corrected, they are, the accommodations tax committee, the accommodations tax grant program will close at the end of April. I'm looking towards Tina. Yes.
Is this, Missy, is this a committee that it would help for us to give ideas about where we would like to see funds go for them to, kind of like we talked about H-Tax?
I would say a couple things. One is state law is very specific, much more specific about use of accommodations tax than it is H-Tax. State law also designates that there has to be this committee process. So that committee does make those allocations. They do, of course, make those allocations in accordance to what city council has recommended or would like to see. In the past, that meant that 85% has gone to Experience Columbia and 15% went to Lake Murray Tourism. That's just been a historical designation for those funds, except for the current year. There's there was a shift in that committee. But yes, we would be looking for direction for that committee as well in preparation for their meeting and review of applications too.
I think it's a lot safer thing for the city to do to maintain the 85-15 rule, and unless we have a specific project that the city wants to do, Finley Park or whatever thing that, because this fund is reviewed by the Turk Committee.
Yes.
And that's why the city years ago decided to do the 85-15. Those two organizations clearly are eligible for the funds that we get. So unless the city has a use for it, Finley Park, et cetera, I don't think we ought to open that pot up to applications from the.
No, I agree.
And
but
I think, Howard,
Yeah.
you bring a good point up, because if you look at the other cities, how they're utilizing it, they're really using it for those type of projects in the
Right.
city. So I don't disagree with your thought process. We just need to think about, as we move forward, what's eligible and what makes sense to utilize some of that.
Is beautification and litter eligible?
I'd have to look back to see where that one sort of fits. I do think it's specific to promotion of, but there are some allowable uses, especially once you exceed $900,000. Usually it's related to allocations towards roadway. No, sir,
No, we
have
haven't.
not.
But we should consider things like that.
Right.
That layers into Columbia SC,
because the-
Experience SC and like.
Yep.
yeah.
Exactly, 'cause-
100%.
Yeah, because these funds are, not just the expenses are reviewed by a specific state review committee, so they do determine whether or not something's eligible.
And that's
Look
why
at
we
it.
haven't put a specific number to the communication and marketing services. But again, the CVB utilizes those funds for communications and marketing services of the region. So hypothetically, we ought to be keeping a portion. I mean, we're gonna determine the eligibility with clarity, but that's, quite the effort that we're about to embark upon, and we're gonna have to pay for that. So if it is eligible, I would suggest
a
that's
great-
considered.
I think that would be eligible.
Yeah, and I think that would be a good use of it, as we see, especially now with.
But I think the process, Mr. Mayor, should be that we determine what we want out of the pot
First,
first, and then the rest of it's 85-15.
I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a good, simple way to look at it, and we can get that. I think that's clear and
So
easy.
that was 85 to the committee? I'm sorry.
They're
No,
just
this-
saying the
Oh, maybe
After,
previous
whatever,
Okay.
breakdown that we're
Left.
gonna have to always use as a guide.
And the committees won't meet until early May, so we have some time for those discussions, but we did want to put this out for city council so that they are ready
well,
to make those
we should
recommendations.
have the
We stay ahead of
RFP
the
back
curve.
too from the marketing as well, which would give us a good indication of what we could allot as well.
The general theme is the accommodation tax is meant to put heads in
It's in
bids.
bids.
Yes.
And the H-tax is to put butts in booths or food. Food.
Your words.
Those are not my words.
Just saying, it's an easy way to remember it.
Live from New York. It's Saturday night.
Okay. Last but not least, tourism development fee. This is a new entry into the budget discussions. These funds have certainly been committed over recent years for the convention center bonds that retired in June. The city has historically collected about $3.5 to $4 million, so we have projected a budget of $4 million. And we have put in there a line item for marketing and promotions and convention center, but leaving those both as to be determined, of course, again, by city council discussions as we continue through our budget process. But have also reflected a debt service of $900,000. Again, that is for the commitment towards the Finley Park rehabilitation.
Well, now, I think once we have the rest of the meetings with the convention center and look at all the projections and understanding what shortfalls will be there, as we know, they have a shortfall every year that has to be covered. And so how that splits between us and the county now that Lexington is no longer part of the equation, I think that will give us a better look to what we may be able to use this for, fill gaps with, or if we just want to, start creating a reserve account as well as part of it for future expansion or growth or whatever. So I think, I would tell us that, it's here, but we gotta get some details figured out first and understand who's committed to what portion. Because right now, the city's a little bit off balance, and we want to try to get that where Richland County and the city of Columbia are equal partners in that process.
We don't have to share the tourism development fee with the county, though.
No, but we have to pay the debt at the convention center. That's how we've been paying it. They lose about $2.5 million a year.
Operational debt.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The last item for, and it may not be a slide deck, no, there's not in the slide deck, but we did provide you a hard copy regarding some city council considerations for specific allocations. Just so as the city manager's preparing her city or proposed budget, some allocations, some discussions for specific projects that city council has been discussing that could be funded out of current year budget, but then also too, looking, as you've mentioned, some direction with regards to next year's budget and things that you would like to see reflected.
Yeah, the citywide, that's like 4 different projects. That's not one. Just to clarify, so as we talk about those and the proposals that go with it, and we'll get into depth at the certain time, but that's 4 different projects. And I know that we've talked about the program as part of a marketing and the show with the influencers. There may be a way that we can do that with a local group that I think we should entertain and look at, that may be more cost effective and really add the local flair that we're trying to portray. But those are all for discussion purposes only.
Yeah, it was important to me, though, that we start capturing, Mayor, and let you be able to put on the table some of these things. And again, some are already, there's funding already allocated in the current year budget to
for
do
those.
some of these. And I know, Mr. Brennan, you had some discussions too previously with the council, which led to some of those allocations of funds to go towards, cultural arts and these type initiatives. So we were just making sure everybody was aware that we're still tracking on that and we're ready to move forward with them.
And I
as
think
you
the bigger
direct us to.
discussion's gonna be there too, as we move forward, as we talk about what our commitments are to One Columbia and others. And I think Mr. Brennan has some ideas there that I think will benefit the community, especially the arts community as a whole. So I think as we do that, and I know that there's some other important, significant arts centers and stuff that we'd like to look at.
Just
Making
telling our
sure.
story set aside, that's a big piece of this RFP for marketing we're putting out to get feedback from whoever we choose, right?
Right.
So that will be a layer of the RFP we put out. If this is the direction we want to go, and I think it's a great direction to promote nationally and regionally who
That
we
was
are.
trying
Yeah.
to take advantage of a syndicated opportunity.
think-
But I think we got to do a little bit more digging as a group and talk about that. And also, to be honest, I'd really like to see what comes back from the marketing group because we don't want to be redundant.
Yeah, it was something separate. This was, the 300,000 was more of a
yeah.
guesstimate for what it would
Right.
take to have
Okay.
like an influencer do a series of shows or something like that, which
And
was
that we
being
would-
discussed before the RFP, Mr. Brennan. But the RFP process, as I just mentioned, we think could be eligible for a, local accommodations or,
Well, and then have the selected group give us the best feedback on how.
sure.
How to leverage that.
Sure, absolutely.
That's great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it also will allow us, really to have some flexibility.
Yes. And then, of course, we already mentioned the continuation. You've got funds that we presented to you all already on the beautification efforts. But if you want to continue with those type efforts, as you just described, we'll see if there's eligibility with these funds as well.
What I'm hoping is, that was one of our asks from our legislative team to help us secure some more opportunities, because we heard from DOT in the process that they don't have any real allocated money for our roads. And so we're hoping that they'll allocate some this year that we could leverage with some of this to keep those gateway programs going, because we have almost 8 different gateways that come into the city, and so making sure those are maintained at their best, and that not one is done and not another. I mean, we want to make sure Monticello Road, North Main, Two Notch, all the way around, each gateway to the city is equally maintained and beautified. That's my word of the day, beautified.
All right,
So we'll
move over to Jeff.
transition to Jeff and pick up on the capital lease program. And there were, we talk about the program all along because on your agendas, you all always support us in allocating funds for the various needs. But I think we need to have an overarching discussion of the program and the repayment and debt service schedules. So Jeff will cover that as well with items 3 and 4.
Good afternoon. Yes, it's now afternoon. So they left me with the really exciting discussion on capital leases and debt service, so glad to be here.
Right.
So I will go fast because I know y'all are really dying to hear from Robert on water and sewer, so.
Robert's much better.
But I want to
Go
go
ahead.
back to, just getting you warmed up now. I want to go back to October, November, when we first started talking about, we had brought y'all the ordinance for a lease, which we utilize. I know Missy has provided memos and staff throughout, we utilize annually most of the time. A financing lease for a lot of our general fund rolling capital. So that's our police cars, public works, and various other vehicles. There is also sometimes some IT equipment that is purchased through that as well, although that's beginning to change as that industry has changed how they provide services. One of the questions that came up, and it was a good question, is trying to understand when we call it a lease, what it really means. So what I wanted to point out is what is a lease. So there's a traditional lease, and in general, that's what a lot of people think of. A traditional lease is entered into in connection with the cities for the use of possibly office space or equipment. We have traditional leases for the copy machines that are right out here, for telephones, for cell phones, things like that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more of how what that means in a traditional lease. Financing lease is entered into with respect to the city's acquisition of vehicles and other equipment. You will generally hear us call this our capital lease instead of a financing lease, although I guess maybe going forward we'll start calling it a financing lease. So what are the differences between these two? In a traditional lease, another party owns that asset. The city may utilize that asset in exchange for the city paying rent. But in that asset, we never acquire the title to it. We don't enjoy the benefit or burdens of ownership of whatever that equipment is. And at the conclusion of that term of the lease, that equipment goes back to the original, whether it's the landlord or whoever we're getting the equipment from. Since we do not acquire title to the asset, we don't exercise rights of ownership, the city cannot finance the payment with tax-exempt obligations. So that's important. Our ability to issue tax-exempt debt, loans, notes, whatever you want to call them, gives us a little bit lower interest rate that can stretch, depending on the term, anywhere from maybe 20 basis points to a full 1%. That has effect on our annual costs.
So it's a line item out of the general fund, basically to pay for if you were to lease
A lot
building.
of times, it's going to show up just as someone's operational cost
Operational cost.
for a traditional lease. I don't think we've really shown you all a full line item for a budget on half of the things that are leased out there.
Yeah, let me make sure I understand. After the lease is over, the equipment or whatever was leased returns back to the owner or it stays with?
It returns to the owner. So that would be for our copy machines. That would be for some of our smaller equipment. That's not what we generally bring you for our vehicles. Because that's what we usually buy for. That's going to be a financing lease. So in the financing lease, the city enters into a lease or a financing agreement with another party that provides financing for the acquisition of the asset. The purpose is to provide a method of financing the acquisition and for the city to own the asset at the conclusion of the agreement. The term may be for more than 1 year. However, another important part, and I'll explain why afterwards, is that it's always subject to annual appropriations. So every year that we pass a budget, we're approving the payment of that financing lease. Now, that's important, and the mayor mentioned this earlier. He talked about restrictions on debt service. So in the past, you've heard us talk a little bit about our general obligation debt and the 8% limit that state law applies to how much you can have out there. This, in general, some people question how this gets around not being part of the 8%. I see you smiling. Because of the annual appropriation clause that's in there, it is not subject to that 8% limit. Now, which really means if we chose not to make a payment one day, we don't have to. I wouldn't recommend that. We'd never get another lease, and it would probably affect everything else credit-wise for the city. But that's the legal language that allows us to do what we do. So the term can be for more than 1 year, and then the rent will be divided into principal and interest payments, similar to payments on a bond. So that's part of the similarity between a financing lease. It makes it look more like a loan, but it's subject to the annual payments. And the final bullet point is because the city acquires the asset, employs the burden and benefit of the ownership of the asset, and makes rent payments that are split between principal and interest, a financing lease may be eligible to be treated as a tax-exempt obligation. So
APR fluctuates
it will. So if
up or down?
So our rate, if it's tax-exempt, will pay less interest.
How's the new way that, Ms. Wilson mentioned that providers are coming up with different ways for leasing. Can you speak to how is that affecting us? The general funds amount, what?
So a lot of our IT type,
Subscription base, is
yeah,
that what you're
it
referring to?
becomes more of a subscription base. So it's something that me and Missy and staff have talked about for the last few years. If you go back 5-10 years ago, we'd buy software up front. That was easier for us for a one-time purchase, and then you might just have some annual maintenance type contracts that were, much smaller than what the amount of the original purchase is. I would kind of say, I won't argue, I'd say, the IT industry has changed. I like to say they've annuitized their product. So they've basically, instead of you just paying one number up front, they're still charging you a big number up front, but then they're also charging you annually, and it's really kind of set up as a lease. In fact, through accounting standards, and Christina's here, and I'm sure she would love to talk to y'all about the GASB standards that are coming in effect. We're gonna have to actually start recognizing some of those leases and subscriptions a little bit differently. I'm not sure if that's gonna have a true effect that y'all will ever see, but it may have some impact on how we report things out, so.
Do they have the annual funding text in there?
No. You know what? That's a good question. I'm gonna have to check on that, because that's one of the questions a few years
annual,
ago we used to
if it's
get
not
with
funded,
bond
we don't pay-
council, is
doesn't
whether or
count.
not it has the annual appropriations type clause in there, so it doesn't get reflected as a true obligation of the general fund that would go against the debt. I'll check on our most recent one. No, for like our subscriptions for IT. That part I'm not 100% sure on. I probably should know that.
But like
but I don't
copier
right now.
machines and all that, they're not changing the format. That's not
No.
subscription-based.
No,
Okay.
that won't, none of that will change. But, you know, cameras is a good example. If you take a look at our cameras, we spent a large chunk back in 2014 or 15. Now it is an annual. Missy, what is that gonna run? About 1.8 million a year? For over a 7-year period. So if you're on the other receiving end of that, it's great. You've annuitized that out over the life of the asset. We prefer, it's usually easier to find the funds up front for a one-time purchase than to try to spread it out over a 7 to 10-year period.
Because we usually wait 2 years before we start paying it, and that's where it adds up. How much on the financing lease do we have total obligated?
Are you talking about how much that, all of our leases combined?
Yeah.
Well, we will get right to that then. These are the last several years of what we've actually issued each year. So back in 14, we issued 7 million.
We start paying it the initial.
If we start
next
paying
year
it that
right away.
year, we make monthly payments on the financing leases. 2015, we did not issue. I honestly cannot recall if that was a budgetary issue or that was also the year of the flood, and we usually issue in December, so that was probably a rather busy time. We probably had to push that off. And then we've issued every year other than 2020. 2020 was, that was right in the midst of the beginning of the pandemic, so we had a lot of things that changed during that time. So here is our total outstanding amount. Over the next roughly 10 years, our payments, total principal paid back will be 24.5 million. Our interest cost is 1.4 million, so the total's 26.
Jeff, when we say, so I see that you say we enter into an agreement. When we say issue, is that what you mean? We're entering into an agreement for X amount of dollars?
Yeah, that would be like for 2002, that'd be our 2002 series or maybe issuance.
Got it, okay.
And
We're basically indebted at this point. Our max number's 26 million.
yes, sir.
Hey, so just out of curiosity, when you set up these payments on a monthly, I mean, looking at the interest payment for an annual basis is about, is that right, 1.4?
I think if you go through each year, it's going to be right around probably 1.5% to 2%. Looking at the history, someone had asked a question just the other night on these. Our interest rates on all of these have ranged anywhere from 1.17% over a 7-year period to the most expensive was this past year. This past year, it was at 3.24%. It's still a pretty good rate when you take a look at what the market's currently doing, and that was just issued 3 months ago. So we're pretty happy with that.
For you just to make an annual payment, one payment, instead of monthly? I mean, based on the number, it shouldn't affect our cash flow, but I'm just curious if there's any benefit to that.
We can take a look at that. I think the way they'll calculate the interest, you've got 5 months of potentially of a small amount of principal that it might change the interest cost a little bit. I don't know if it'd actually improve it though, but we'll take a look at that. Traditionally, we go out for bids on these every December. So we get a lot that come in, and most all have structured those out monthly. But this upcoming year, we can talk with, we utilize bond counsel and staff to put that out. So we can take a look to see if there's a benefit to do it that way.
Yeah, I thought about something else that maybe we could do locally too, that maybe we ought to talk about at some point. That,
Okay.
you know, based on what we have for deposits, is there a way to trade off interest for similar program or something? I don't know. I've seen it done in some other places. I just don't know enough about it to talk about it intelligently yet, but just curious if we couldn't leverage some of our percentage points, especially with some of the rates we're getting today.
Yeah, so, and we do open this to everyone. We try to find, all of our local banks are asked to participate, as are a lot of the national banks. I will say, certain banks, it depends on the type of loan that's out there, they have a tendency to be focused on. Bank of America has probably won every bid except for 1 year. In 2017, I think Regions Bank had the best pricing.
Cool. Thank you.
Regions Bank.
Well, you know, we got to be creative today. This one's the one that always scares me.
Yes, so these get into the big numbers. So since we're talking about fun things, let's talk about outstanding governmental debt.
2053, I don't believe I'm going to be here, but I hope somebody else celebrate that payoff.
Yeah, I'm hoping I'm not here too. If I'm giving this presentation to y'all in 2053, y'all great in some ways, but I don't know.
You'll get the Aubrey Jenkins Award. Oh, yeah, GC.
So this is all of our governmental debt. This encompasses both our GEO bonds that are still outstanding from 2015 and 2016. Also the JETA bond that we issued in 2020. There's a very just small little piece of that. That's mostly all repaid. And then our IPRB is also a governmental bond, so it's included in this. And that was the larger one that we issued just a little over a year and a half ago, and that was for about 51 million. So our true outstanding government obligation debt at the end of this year will be roughly 15 million, which has come down. When we were having these discussions a few years ago, we were around 35 to 40 million. So that has a true impact on what we,
Say that again, Jeff.
when we were having these discussions less than, I don't know, time flies. I was going to say it wasn't that long ago. Maybe it's been 10 years now. But we were as high as 35 to 40 million. 1 year, 10 years.
So what's the principal, what'd you say the outstanding was currently?
At the end of this year, our outstanding principal of just GEO debt will be about 15 million, which has come down. We've been paying that off.
Yeah,
Now,
I'd like to,
it's a part of the 67 million. For that's the outstanding principal. So just so we're clear, that's how the principal total is 67 million. That's all of our governmental outstanding debt. Each year, that's how much we're paying off towards that. Now, this will go up next year, the Finley Park bond, even though we're going to pay for it, and Missy showed y'all with tourism development fee and state accommodations tax, it'll actually reflect as governmental bond debt.
yeah, I'd like, at some point, I'd love to dig into it a little bit more too and understand if there's some advantage points to pay down some principal earlier if we have an opportunity and how that affect long-term and saving us, because the interest is a good portion.
Yes, on most of these, our interest rates are typically under 5%, which is still good, but over a 20 and 30-year period, you can see the amount of interest that gets paid out. So it does have a overall effect on the budget each year. Water and sewer debt service schedule. Robert will talk to y'all a little bit more about that. Probably not as focused on water and sewer debt service today as he will be in about 2 to 4 weeks. Our stormwater debt service, we have one stormwater bond outstanding. We issued that back in 2016 or 17. At the time, it was 43 million, so we've paid off about 7 million of that. Then parking debt service, we really only have one outstanding bond. It was issued in 2005 and built several garages around the city. We're down, I think the initial issuance on that was about 46 million. We're down to 31 million. I will add, this does not include future debt issuance that will be necessary to repay back the cash that we use for the Bull Street parking decks. That'll be about 16.5 million, which will issue.
We need to talk about that at some point. I'm concerned that we start pushing that out that far. We're really paying for it for so much longer than the value and what we're gonna have to pay for upgrades and everything else. And that, you know, as we get the parking study back and we get the value of what we have, maybe we can, you know, bring it to economic development or something and talk about what creative things we could do to lessen that burden for that far out. I hate pushing something out that far, and I know you had to do what you had to do when you had to do it, but now I think we're in a different position to look at some things.
We are. So the fact that y'all have actually are requesting a parking study, a parking rate study, again, I've been here 14, 15 years now. We've never had a serious conversation about that. So if you look at other markets, we're well below. Us having the capacity and willing to raise some of those rates may impact whether or not we have to issue that debt or we can just pay it straight back out of cash.
I don't have any bounty, so I'm doing the best I can.
If we pay back the,
If we did that, Jeff, does that mean incrementally?
for the parking system? It would require that. We don't have a current rate structure to make additional payments or to pay early on paying that off. I think our first focus, though, for the rate study for parking, and again, I feel like I'm being, parking rate analyst isn't here, but one of our focuses is taking a look at the current maintenance of the current parking garages and making sure that we can increase those rates and make sure that we can bring them back up to the standards that we want them to be at. And then secondary, we'll take a look at repayment of this debt before the bonds themselves are actually issued. Hospitality tax debt service schedules. That's our total outstanding debt for
Majority
hospitality
of
tax.
that's the stadium, correct?
Yes, sir. We issued a bond in 2023. I'm sorry, 2003. I was not here. We
No,
issued a
it's not
bond
all
back
the stadium,
then.
'cause it
Most
was
of that's been paid off.
2003, but I can't remember, I wasn't here then, but I don't remember
Yeah,
what
it
was
paid
issued
for tennis courts. There was numerous projects around the city that it paid for. It's been a while.
So we had some,
Anyone still here? Oh, Southeast Park. Yes. I think it started some of our signage program that we kind of redid about 2 years ago as well. And then I think we've utilized it on smaller projects throughout the city with some of the proceeds, really even as late as 5 or 6 years ago. But yes, the majority of that 29 million is what helped pay for Segra Park. We paid for roughly 2/3 of the park, of the baseball park. And Robert will be next with water and sewer operations. I will say, the mayor asked, and I don't have it up here, about reserves and how we look at each particular debt service and what the type of requirements are. They all vary. It depends upon what the rating agencies expect, and then some of them are our own internal policies. So we'll put that information together and get that back out to y'all.
yeah, great. Hey, Jeff, before you leave, a question I had earlier that I wasn't sure about is, on the hospitality tax revenue, we showed in 21 interest negative, and then next year positive, and then we show budget included negative. I mean, it's only 37,000, but I couldn't
Yeah.
understand what we had
So-
a negative interest.
I'll have to look at that, but I suspect each year, our investment portfolio has to be marked to the market. When interest rates are going up, anything you currently own becomes a little less valuable because it's at a fixed interest rate. In fact, you could kind of say that's a problem some of our banks around the world are having at this very moment. The effect on us is very minor because we have a very small portfolio that sits in interest rate sensitive investments. But that's the effect at the end of the year. It doesn't mean we took a physical cash loss. You only take that loss if you sold it. We have a tendency to hold ours to maturity. So we'll pick that back up somewhere down
Just
the road.
hadn't seen that before, negative interest.
The last time that we've had that was probably 2011, because it was very painful, because those were some rough years to begin with, to the bottom line. We have not had that as a major issue until just this past year. I mean, we're all aware the Federal Reserve has raised rates numerous times, and so that has an effect on your portfolio.
Jeff,
Thank
does-
you.
Does, the various athletic events that happen in our city, the food and bev sales, does that qualify for hospitality tax?
It does.
It does. So Fireflies, USC,
Yes.
they all pay a hospitality
They all
tax
pay.
off of the
In fact,
percentage.
we saw an increase in it during the eclipse of 2017.
Right.
Yeah, but we spent that increase on glasses.
I know.
So it was a net break even.
Glasses were cheap.
I think I still have
2
some.
million, how many you buy? It was some crazy, 200,000?
We had quite a few.
Mr. Mayor, can we take 5 minutes?
5-minute break, yes, sir.
Thank you, Jeff. And we'll take 5 minutes, Robert, okay?
He's out there pacing. He's ready. Let's get back. My dear friend Robert's in the house.
I didn't know about it until I saw it on the news. Not that I knew, but
I do like it. Even though he doesn't bring good news, I like it.
Hi, Robert.
Okay.
So our water and sewer rate study overview, Mr. Robert Chambers, MBA, Principal Consultant with Black and Beach. Good to see you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you all. Morning. Again, thank you very much for having us here. We're here today just
Were you by
to,
yourself?
I am today. You know, we're just here today to talk and discuss the process, what it will take, what are some of the things we're seeing as we kind of go through this study, and just, you know, as we typically do, get the feedback and guidance from you all so that we can understand and incorporate it as we go forward. So this is a quick layout of the agenda. We'll go through the drivers, you know, speak about how we got here, lay out some objectives going forward, and then briefly discuss our approach. And this is important because there's a structure and a framework that's utilized that you have kind of, from a policy and a strategic direction, laid the foundation for us. And it's important that as we go through the process, we keep revisiting to make sure that we're doing what it is we're supposed to do as it relates to the development of the rates and meeting the objectives as highlighted. So we have three basic purposes. You know, the first of which is to go about doing a study so that we can appropriately and fully fund our operating and capital requirements, which becomes the first step of 3 steps. The second step then becomes making sure we understand the cost of service, what it costs to operate the system, what costs may be expected in the future, and incorporating those costs as we analyze that particular year into the cost service in order to understand what is the impact the different groups of customers have on your system, and then going about pricing the services, making sure that from a rate design perspective, we price rates and have rates that achieve the adequate revenues to allow you to meet your revenue requirements or your cost on an annual basis.
Robert, I'm sure you're familiar with the EPA proposal regulation of PFAS.
Yes, we've been following.
Will you be able to
following it.
touch on that during your analysis of cost to show us what $150 million will do to the cost of water? for
But
the city of Columbia?
can we clarify that? Because one of the things that all this is being put out in the news, but it hasn't actually been put into place and or authorized. So, I mean, we don't even know that it's gonna be a requirement yet. They were out putting this information out, creating stir and scare in people's neighborhoods and in the water systems, but it hadn't even been authorized at the federal level. So I think we need to follow up on some information on exactly where it is as well.
I
You
think
know,
one
but-
of our arguments, though, Mayor, would be we need to know what impact it will have on the water cost in the city of Columbia, so that we can take those comments to EPA and to our congressional delegation to show that you're talking about a major increase in the cost of water. And
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I just want, it's how we frame it, because if you read the headlines in the newspapers and everything, you thought it was coming down as an edict tomorrow, and we're
60
suddenly.
days.
Yeah, and that's not the case. So I think how we present that and how we plan for it, I think you're absolutely correct. We want to be able to talk to the folks in Washington about the effect it will have, adverse effect it will have at this point, and there's got to be a different way to handle that going forward for the future.
Totally agree, Mr. Mayor. And what I would add is, as more information comes down as we start to get a better understanding of, you know, how to deal with these contaminants, the processes and procedures, the framework that will be instituted from a regulatory and an operating perspective, and as a result of that framework, what it will cost you to implement and maintain these mitigation activities, you know, then we'll be able to understand and incorporate what those costs will look like, let's say from a capital and an operating perspective. But I think everybody's well aware of, you know, this issue, and that is something we need to keep track of as we go forward.
And I think there's a lot more technology and treatment processes than have been explored so far. We've seen that. There's a lot of technology, especially in Israel and other places that are addressing issues at a lot higher rate and more efficient and effective cost rate than we are. So I'm curious to see, you know, what all comes to the table.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's funny because, you know, every year we do this study, and some of these same issues and variables keep coming up. They may come in a different form or shape. You know, like for example, you know, this slide highlights, you know, what are the big issues affecting the industry? Aging infrastructure. You just asked me about how do we justify the CIP, right? Managing capital costs, you know, resiliency, treatment of treatment technology. You know, it's the same thing everybody's dealing with. And even right here in South Carolina, as we understand, a number of utilities every utility, I could say, is dealing with some of these same issues in varying capacities. You know, but these are some of the things that are driving the industry and continue to drive the industry. And, you know, at least we're here talking about it and going through it as we continue to understand and grow through it. So moving on. So from a industry best practice perspective, there are a few things we like to highlight that we try to do on an annual basis, just as a part of the process of aligning this financial planning process with your budgeting and your operating processes. So from a financial planning and a rate setting perspective, there are a few things that you do on an annual basis, or you do period, to make sure that you're aligned with certain best practices. For example, understanding and defining your financial performance standards, meaning what are the metrics you're going to abide by and utilize and track on an annual basis to make sure, you know, you are financially operating in a sound manner. For example, debt service coverage, right? In addition, for this type of study, how often do you do the study? You know, typically the best practice is that you check it and do it every year, and you do it as a part of your annual budgeting process. We're here in the budget meeting presenting, so that's a check. And then perform cost of service periodically, annually, so that you can keep and understand what are the characteristics of how your system is generating costs, who's driving that cost, and you're doing that. And then reviewing your rates annually to make sure that you're self-sufficient, and as a whole, your system can stand on its own. So these are certain best practices that we always highlight, because you always get questions, why are we doing this? What's the purpose? What's the value? You know, these are the value and the big blocks that we stand up on as it relates to how we plan for water and sewer. Okay, so focusing on the drivers, you know, maintaining revenue stability and financial sufficiency. We just went through that in detail on the previous slide. You know, operating resilience, right? You know, for the investments that you're making, how you're implementing these projects, and then how you're executing the maintenance of these projects, you know. Are you doing it in a way that allows you to extend and preserve the life of these assets, maintain a resilient system that allows you to react to unforeseen events, and understand when events are coming so you can plan ahead. Mr. Mayor, I know you just spoke about debt service and how we can get in front of it. You know, the goal is to always have the opportunity to get in front of these, you know, maintenance issues, for example, doing more preventative versus corrective, right?
And in that same thought process, Robert, one of the things I think would be helpful for us as we get back together is also, what are the opportunities for us to leverage private partnerships to increase? You know, we talk about resiliency, you gotta think about other things too. Is there opportunities for us to work and create some more opportunities to get more methane gas out of the system by working with a private group so that we could offset some other cost structures in that allows us to make more investments? I mean, we spend what, Clint, 1.8 million on sludge removal, roughly. You know, if there's ways that we can leverage that, we could create, the gas market right now is pretty resilient. You know, putting that out, and could we reap the benefits from that, or even put it into a drying system to dry the sludge, or bring in a partner to do some more enhancements? It's our biggest power user is the wastewater plant.
Okay.
You know, how do we offset some of those, and just getting, what are other people doing to be creative to deal with some of the issues without having to either create more employees to handle that or have to put out so much more capital where there's an opportunity to partner where both parties win?
No, I get you. It's more about trying to understand, as that example with sludge removal, what we're doing, what can we do, what are others doing, you know, how can we?
And I know y'all meet with so many different groups that you see that. I know Jacksonville does some stuff, and Nashville and some other places, but you know, where are some leverage points?
Yeah, I'll get with staff and we can come back to you and.
Because I don't want to ask the engineers, because it'll cost us twice as much and they'll overbuild it. I want to do it where somebody has already figured that out.
And I just motion to Clint, we've had some preliminary conversation about methane gases and that sludge, excuse me, the sludge that is gathers on the water. We've had some preliminary, and how that could very well be, for lack of a better word, useful. So we've had some of that conversation.
I know that inside and out. But, you know, my question is, what are other people doing, and how could we look at that and figure out a way to leverage that?
Okay. So, continuing as it relates to the drivers, one of the emerging drivers that we've seen over the last, let's say, 12 to 18 months, you know, is the advent of inflation. The cost of money, the price of goods and services, and, you know, that is having an impact on the cost of your operations. And, you know, we are taking that into consideration, and we'll be working with staff to understand and make the necessary adjustments so that, you know, we can recover what it's costing you to operate as a result of inflation. And, you know, we want to continue to watch and understand it, but, you know, I just want to acknowledge that it's a reality that we're dealing with right now, and it's something that we will come back to you with. And then, you know, how you engage your customers and your stakeholders, you know, because ultimately your customers are the ones we all serve, and they will continue to ask questions about their rates, better service, maintenance of service, and it's about how do we continue to engage them in a enhanced and optimized manner that is clear, transparent, and allows them to get the information they require.
Absolutely.
Robert, if we comparatively look at the drivers as I'm looking at it today,
Okay.
comparatively to last year,
Okay.
how are they different?
So, okay, great question. One of the biggest, there's a few differences. Overall, the drivers are not that different. The general structure of the drivers are the same, because it takes a little time for a driver to not become a driver anymore, for example. But one of the changes we're seeing, or one of the new items and adjustments, is inflation. And it's not that inflation last year or the year before was not a driver or didn't have a component or part of, let's say, the cost of services. It has just taken a more significant role with regard to how you operate, so it has to be acknowledged and highlighted. Another component could be, let's say, staffing, right? And how do we go about, and staffing was a driver last year, for example, but it continues to be a driver and it continues to have greater significance because of how the competitiveness of the job market and the challenges that staff goes through with regard to finding resources. And this is not just the city of Columbia. That's something that's happening nationally across all disciplines, all industries. So that becomes another component that has a little more prominence now because we are about 2 years through this process and we're getting to truly understand what those realities are. But the general structure and the framework it will change over time, but probably not on a year-to-year basis unless there's something significant, as is the case with inflation currently.
Staffing would come in both for providing the labor, but also for the inflationary pressure of the wages that we will have to pay to get staffing to fill the vacancies.
Yeah.
So I think staffing hits us a double whammy. We got to get the labor. In order to get the labor, you're going to have to raise wages considerably.
Yeah, that's a fair.
Well, I think
be
at the same time,
competitive
you gotta
if
you gotta
yeah.
look at what are the shortfalls, and are there things in today's world that technology and a third party can provide, and how do those leverage out with that? Because, between raising salaries and you got benefits that are 42% cost structure, how does that all balance out? So I think it's a great time for us to dive into some of that. And this is where I think Robert's knowledge, Lycan Beach, serves so many cities like ours that we can kind of see what other people are doing too, and how somebody else has done this and they'll tell us if it works or it doesn't, or the pitfalls. And so I think this is a great exercise for us.
So I think in working with staff and working with your management and executive team, they've been really holding this ball and trying to, sort out staffing, trying to understand. I know, when I look around on your system and look at what you're doing as it relates to program management and the augmentation of services to support your existing services, I can say and see that as an organization, you're trying to implement some of the same processes and procedures and the diligence, most importantly, that others around the country are doing in order to try to challenge this issue. But, it's one of the things you really don't understand the challenge until you get deep in it, but it takes some time to get deep in the challenge. So I think you're walking through that process. But there's always things you can do to keep being better.
Robert, are you going to be able to, we look at the work orders in the field, and then balancing staffing levels like we're talking about. Are you able to look at our commitment to bringing on smaller contractors, these subcontractors that we're using, to see if that is a benefit, a cost savings as we move forward to continue that?
So I wouldn't be able to look directly into like work orders or the nature of the contractors and the size and the value as such. What we would do is just get the costs associated with that cost center or department on a total system basis, incorporate it into the financial plan that we developed, and then say
So the actual
what the impact on
the
rates
implementation of the efficiencies and effectiveness is not. That's you're a bigger picture.
For this project, we wouldn't do that for this project, but Clint.
So, Councilman, one of the things that we've been doing internally, and we'll share the information with Robert, of course, but looking at our pace of the decrease in work orders and backlog and how much contractor support we've been using to help accelerate that pace versus staffing, We've also done some cost analysis that we'll share on, you know, what it's costing. We capture all of our work in CityWorks, what it's costing our team to do a repair versus what our bid prices are and our indefinite delivery pricing is for contractors. So that's something we'll share as part of the Columbia Water update, where we'll be asking for contractor support as well as our staffing, that combination to continue working down that backlog. And that package of requests gets rolled into Robert's rate calculations to determine, okay, what are our needs? And then we can talk about how aggressively we want to be to continue working down that. It is based on funding level and how many staff we hire, but also how many contractors we employ.
Well,
Balance. Got some good
and I think understanding the timing that goes around it, you know, I think your goal is to eliminate having multiple calls over one issue. And so if we can solve that, but then also at the same time, allowing our team to do what they do best and let them excel at that and let us fill the gap where they get too much pressure and have to try to, you know, scrounge to make something happen. That's not fair to them either. And I think, you know, get them focused on what they do best.
That's the model.
Clint, have you trained the contractors in CityWorks, or do you have a teenager assigned to put it in for them?
They're not a teenager, but we do have junior staff assigned to do the input, the work orders. We don't allow the contractors access to the CityWorks platform, but they fill out the work order summaries, and then that's entered by an administrative person to make sure we're capturing. That's how we're cost accounting for theirs and are able to do a comparison with our repairs. Sorry, Robert.
So, you know, we're discussing these issues, you know, and I think this slide is very relevant at the time because, you know, we have a bunch of competing variables. For example, you know, some significant events, you know, have happened. Let's say the Clean Water 2020 program, the consent decree, you know, your flooding event, the AMI program, you know, building out your stormwater system, you know, kind of restructuring and building out the operations of Columbia Water. And, you know, you do this with the intention of building and maintaining a resilient utility. But as you do it, you implement specific programs and requirements, you know. And in implementing those programs, we try to maintain, let's say, financial viability. We try to maintain our ability to manage the cost to operate. We try to understand, for example, let's say the AMI program, what will be the impact of the AMI program on your operations? And that's something we're looking at, you know, right now to understand. And, you know, we're seeing some impacts, just as we are seeing impacts with inflation. So you have these active programs that you have in place that are so connected to these events. And for example, you had COVID-19. And in all of these programs, for all of these events, you know, for example, the issues around COVID-19 touch these programs. So the highlight here is what we do as it relates to how we manage and monitor the financial program becomes a balancing act as it relates to these competing variables. And in one case, you may have something like the PFAS requirements that may come down, having a significant impact. You may have AMI that may have an impact on revenues. You have inflation. So from year to year, the challenges that are presented become different. And it's a matter of just trying to continuing to understand these challenges as we go about presenting the decisions that have to be taken and presenting the impacts to your operations. Okay? So you've seen this slide before, and the big thing we wanted to highlight with this slide is, you know, historically, there was a little lumpiness, you know, as it relates to revenue increases. Over the last few years, I know in 23 there wasn't an increase. In 22, if I'm not mistaken, there was an increase, and in 2021 there was not. And you know, all we're seeing here is typically, you know, cost keeps going up. You know, there's a certain consistency with cost. We know that, we've been through some tough times, but as we go forward, as best we can take the necessary steps, to adjust rates as needed in order to provide the services that we need to provide as an entity. It typically works out better and saves a lot more cost in the long run versus having more lumps or longer durations of no increases than having to catch up. And I'm saying that to say there will be a need, there could be a need, there is a need, there's an increase. It's not just saying it should be an increase.
But
You
I
know,
think at the
a
same time,
justified,
Robert,
yeah.
as we get to that discussion, I think it's time for us to evaluate the system as well.
Okay, fair.
Because we're, for some of the wastewater that we do outside the city ends up costing us a lot more than there any value. And that's our most expensive investments if you look at future. So the future, do we want to grow that, or do we want to just make sure that we maintain and focus on growth internally in the limits and not get out? But then on the water side, we have an opportunity to grow the system because that is a true revenue generator. And so should we be looking at that? What are the increases that we know are coming with future growth, and where are there opportunities for us to grow? And I don't know that we've ever looked at it from that standpoint. And I think we're at that juncture where we should look at that. Where should we maybe levelize? We're not going to do any more wastewater outside of the city because the travel cost is so much per square cubic foot. Are we better off taking an opportunity to grow our water customers where we know we can deliver service effectively, efficiently without the added costs that we do with wastewater? So I think it'd be interesting for us to have a little more discussion about that. Where are opportunities that we could take advantage of that create more revenue without always having to go to the ratepayers?
Okay.
Just a balancing act, because it may be a combination of both.
Okay.
Especially, costs have just really significantly increased, and we're seeing it. A lot of suppliers are reaching out and talking about the massive increase. Obviously, as you know, the gas volatility lately, it's been all over the board. It's been very hard to forecast when it comes to natural gas, and then obviously, we've seen when every chemical and everything we use has gone up significantly and supply is down. So we're still not stabilized yet.
I understand. Okay, so just to set the groundwork as we do, this is the financial plan that was presented last year. It was presented with no increase in 2023. But at the time, we anticipated somewhere in the range of about a 7.7% for 24, with a few other 7% in 25 and 26, and then it dropped below 7 in 27. We met all our financial metrics, or we achieved our financial metrics over the plan. The reason why we're presenting this is, this becomes somewhat of a starting point to go back and look at, how did revenues change, based on what we're currently seeing today with billing determinants. How did O&M change, for example, operating and maintenance expenses, based on current happenings, let's say inflation and other requirements. And for example, based on those two adjustments or those changes, how is that affecting the financial plan, and how is it adjusting the financial plan? So for example, if you have something like AMI, that may have some impact on revenues, because now you have a few more change outs, you have some better readings, for example, and then you have O&M that's going up, there's some balancing that happens there, right? So those are the things we're working through currently with staff, and we go back and forth as it relates to looking and diligencing and making sure everything reconciles. But we'll bring that back to you and discuss it all with you to look at and understand the impacts. But this is what we were seeing last year as a starting point and a baseline.
And Clint, does Robert have all the projections of future growth that we see? Just want to make sure that we're including every scenario as we have to make some decisions.
So going forward, you know, this slide is just talking about the value of water. And, you know, what I'll highlight, I know we've seen this before, but I like this slide. And what I'll highlight is the fact and the reality that, you know, the daily cost of water usage, for example, is about 76 cents. Wastewater is, you know, a little less than double. Let's say almost double, right? $1.41. You know, if you compare what the value of water is on a per unit basis as compared to, you know, paying $1 for a gallon of bottled water, right? There's a significant difference as it relates to what you're paying. And that's the biggest thing we always try to highlight. And let's say for that 76 cents or that $1.41, you know, you turn on the spigot and service is available. You go to shower and do what you do in your homes and as a part of, you know, daily life, and service is available. So it's a value-added service.
Robert, you got to get a marketing team to put together a better pitch on that, because it's important to know, you know. But you know, just looking at the numbers, you know, the average customer, you know, doesn't register the importance of this. But yeah,
Thank you.
better messaging.
I know you all have seen it before, but I didn't want to over push it, so I just
You pay less than a penny. You pay less than a penny to drink it, but it costs you $1.40 to get rid of it.
You know, so every few years, Black and Veatch publishes a top 50 survey of water and wastewater systems of their current rates. And what we wanted to highlight is for the utilities that were observed over the period 2008 through 2020, you know, their adjustments for water and sewer respectively were about 6% and 5.8%.
Is that all municipal or is that private and municipal?
All municipal, top 50 municipal. And, you know, Columbia Water over the period was 4.7, a little less. You know, over that same period, you know, the focus here is not so much on the numbers, is more on the gradual progress and the increase in the bills, you know, let's say over 2 decades, right? You know, over 2 decades, the bills almost doubled or just over doubled. And that's to that point earlier with regard to increasing rates or not, and the impact.
That's national average.
Yeah, that's for the top 50 largest that we survey. And the message here is the bills have been going up, you know, for you know, obvious reasons. The cost of living and everything is going up. And just looking at the impact and the change over time is what we're highlighting here. Okay.
People who made the most money in utilities are the internet companies, the phone companies, the cable companies.
So this slide is just highlighting on a typical utility bill basis, you know, from let's say 2001 through 2020, what are the typical utility bills looking like and how they're increasing over time. You know, that orange bar represents a combined water and sewer bill. The black represents bundled cable. The blue represents cell phone bills, and the gray represents energy bills. And yes, Mr. Mayor, as you see it, the bundled cable is significantly increasing.
That's why I switched cable providers. Paid $120 a month.
So is, if you look at the cell phones, over time, you know, it kind of jumped in the 2010s, 11s, and it's coming down now for maybe that's just competition and more providers providing more services, so more goods chasing dollars. But if you look at combined water and sewer as compared to, you know, the other industries, it's been increasing at a slower and more gradual level. And in comparison to the other industries, you know, all the services here are valuable, you know what I mean? But it's an essential service for life, for living, for everything. So we just wanted to show it as a comparison, you know, to say, compared to the other utility services, you know, it's relative.
It's a deal.
Robert, wastewater utility only, a wastewater utility, it would be under guide of the Public Service Commission, correct?
Or,
As far as rates and everything.
no, okay, so with the Public Service Commission typically, and Clint, you can come if you wish, it's investor. It's the investor-owned utilities typically would have to fall under the PSC. For a wastewater utility, it would be treated just as the water sewer utility, you know, within the city of Columbia. And you have even utilities in South Carolina that just operates wastewater.
Spot on, Robert. I think East Richland Public Service District, they're not regulated by Public Service Commission. They've got they're public and they've got an appointed board. And so there are quite a few sewer providers, wastewater providers in the state that are public entities, boards, commissions, those sorts of things. Upstate has quite a few of those. It's separate from the water provision, but they're not regulated by the PSC. It's only that private ownership piece that puts you in the PSC.
But who would be mindful of the rate increases at
So
decent clips?
it's their either elected or appointed board. So for East Richland, for example, I think it's an appointed board. And county council members usually make those appointments. So that's how it's tied in.
Private sector waste management utilities are
Public
Public
service.
Service
Yes,
Commission.
sir.
Gotcha.
So, you know, this is the approach that we will take to answer the three questions: how much money is needed, from whom should it be collected, and how should it be priced. You know, one thing I'd like to highlight, you know, we're looking at revenues and taking a deep look at revenues just to make sure we understand, given the time, what the impacts will be. We're also looking at costs around all the items and variables we've highlighted to make sure we understand variables being inflation, you know, and other costs and the impacts, whether it be energy, chemicals, you know, and what those may look like as it relates to them escalating over the next 3 to 5 years and how it will impact operations. So we're looking at those items to get a good baseline estimate of what revenues and costs will be, to come back to you and say, you know, this is what we're seeing. Okay. So this is the approach we're using to answer these three questions. So the next steps is to complete that base case financial plan. Thereafter, go through the cost of service analysis. Upon completing the base case financial plan through staff, we'll come back and discuss what the impacts are as it relates to revenue increases and just the impacts on your operations. And collectively, we'll have a recommendation as it relates to the proposed revenue increase. Okay. Any questions?
We're gonna have that next week, right?
Jeff? I'm joking.
Robert's good at it, man. He knows how to push it off.
But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Robert. Always a pleasure to have you here.
And yes, sir, we will be bringing that back as we progress through the budget workshops. One of the items that I just wanted to share, because I know you all are interested in our ARPA funding and things we've allocated so far, and discussions potentially about additional allocations. So we're going to hand that out to you now, just for your reference. We don't have to really get into it in any depth, but if there are any questions about what you see as far as things that are committed, please ask. I know there's potentially, I know, Mayor, some other housing-related partnerships, if state funding might be available, so we want to keep that in mind as well. I was trying to see, Missy, did we, I know at one point we had a line item, but I think as council made commitments, maybe that one isn't on here for housing related.
What's on this list is basically what has
Have been committed, okay,
been lots of discussion.
yep.
Just for clarification, our Rapid Shelter, weren't we able to use the home money that we got, that separate 2.5 for that? No.
No, not yet. And that has to go towards, maybe potentially some of the things you all are talking about, like the bigger campus, or if you had a,
Home money, we got 2.5 million from
Yeah.
ARPA. We got
But
that
it-
extra allotment.
non-congruent.
I thought we had used it for that, but it didn't qualify.
No,
So-
sir.
I mean, I think
No.
the one thing that we want to try to do is, if we can, is try to put a little bit, hold some money to see if we can leverage it with the state to deal with the other properties that we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But we did get some dollars
Greenview.
for Rapid Shelter
Yeah,
from
yeah,
other
yeah, yeah.
sources,
No, no.
yeah.
No, I just want to make sure it was in the right place.
So how much do we have remaining?
How do you read this
Yeah, how
chart?
do you read this?
Go to the mic, Missy. Missy, to the,
About 10 million.
Which way
does
you
it
going?
say
You
that?
going
I
down?
go from the top here, all the way to the top,
Oh, okay.
to the bottom. That's total committed, that's total received, and then there's the target 5% in between. It's quick math, I mean, just.
Okay,
it's
okay,
between
yeah.
9 and 10.
Yeah.
I do think, obviously this will come up more in discussion over the next several weeks during budget, but I do think we ought to put in our head that we ought to hold $1 million towards that housing.
10 million.
Tina, don't you agree?
I just wanted to, I don't know, had we looked to see if it qualifies? That was the only question I had.
we can't, we will. I mean, I think we're working through the structure of the program. If it's similar to what we've already done, then we'll use that as a guide. What did we call that before, housing related? Because we had the $1 million before. Can't remember what we called it.
Can we use any of this funding for like sidewalks and infrastructure, going back to what we were looking for, dollars? I don't know if it's a qualified expense, but.
Right.
So we have toyed with those. Of course, it's always subject to interpretation, but pathways and healthy lifestyles is a loose sort of interpretation in terms of how that can make it eligible programmatically. If it's not eligible under one of the American Rescue Plan programmatic areas, then it would come from our allotment of lost revenue, which we're trying to conserve that for other activities that may have been committed, but
I would say, I think as we talk about and see where some possible needs are, but, if we could put some more into some of the fire stations and others, if we have, if it's, mattresses or bedding or, some clean room, whatever, I would just say we just look at what we have some flexibility for some more amounts out of here to go internally to solve some of the capital needs, that we know we have a lot of.
Okay.
But I also, you know, I would hope that we don't, I mean, we got, what, 2 more years left? So we
Thereabouts.
we may wanna hold on to some for something else that pops up that may qualify.
Technically, we have until
Like about
December of
1
20.
year.
Yeah, December of 2024 to get the funds committed.
Okay.
And at today, and I'm looking at Christine as well, our latest news or instruction is that we have until the 2026 to actually expend it. Treasury is still sort of bouncing around definitions of what that means, but that's today's instructions.
Thank you, Missy.
Clarification.
So we made note of those items, Mayor, and we'll double check eligibility, of course. Anything else you all want us to
As we
look
keep
at?
going through the budget,
Okay.
we know what's here, but I think the biggest was knowing that we
What's
had some
available.
flexibility,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to that potential housing piece that could be critical for us.
Yes, sir. Flexibility. Yes, got it.
You want to go into executive session before we break?
Yes, if you don't mind, and get some lunch, and I think there's one item, if you could add it for me. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I move we go into executive session for discussion of matters related to the proposed location, expansion, or provision of services, encouraging location or expansion of industries or other businesses in the area served by the public body pursuant to SC Code 30-4-785, Project Royale, Capital City Stadium, discussion of the employment of an employee pursuant to 30-4-70A1, city manager and city attorney evaluations, Columbia Richland 911 Communications Center, receipt of legal advice relating to a pending, threatened, or potential claim pursuant to 30-4-70A2, Peak versus City of Columbia, receipt of legal advice related to matter covered by attorney-client privilege pursuant to 30-4-70A2, mill sharing ordinance.
Yeah.
Is there a motion?
Second.
Second, a motion. Madam Clerk, can you read the roll?
Yes.
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 Aye.